Follow the money, they say, and you'll find the truth. But when it comes to the Bush family fortune, following the money leads down rabbit holes that most historians prefer to avoid, and most journalists are too frightened to explore fully. Of course, when you hear the name Bush, you likely picture presidential libraries, controversial wars in the Middle East, Texas ranches, and that awkward moment when George W. dodged a shoe in Baghdad. A classic American success story, depending on who you ask. And what a story it seems. 2 presidents, governors, senators, CIA directors. The Bush legacy gleams with electoral gold, reading like a political monopoly game where one family owns all the properties. Yet beneath this red, white and blue triumph lies a foundation built on something far darker. Transactions so controversial that their exposure once threatened to topple everything. We're talking about seized bank accounts, federal investigations, and connections to the darkest chapter in human history. Consequently, in today's episode of Old Money Luxury, we uncover the buried history of America's most untouchable political dynasty. A story of how forbidden money became the foundation for unimaginable power. In the halls of American power, where political dynasties come and go like seasons, the Bush family stands as an enduring monument to wealth, influence, and, remarkably, survival through scandal. Indeed, with a combined fortune hovering around $400 to $500 million, this Connecticut-to-Texas clan has transformed from New England aristocrats into a political machine that produced 2 presidents, multiple governors, and enough corporate board members to fill a country club dining room. And they've done it all while carrying a dark secret from the 1940s that would have destroyed most families, but somehow only made the Bushes stronger. Today, George W. Bush, the 43rd president who led America through September 11th and into Iraq, sits comfortably on a personal fortune of $40 million. That's double what he had when he entered the White House in 2001. Not bad for a man who was once dismissed as a failed oilman and baseball team owner. His post-presidency has been surprisingly lucrative. Between 2009 and 2015 alone, Bush gave over 200 speeches at 6-figure fees. His memoir, Decision Points, became an instant bestseller. And in perhaps the most unexpected twist, his amateur paintings of world leaders and military veterans have earned him respect in art circles and hefty price tags from collectors. The late George H.W. Bush, patriarch and 41st president, left behind $25 million when he passed in 2018. But that number barely scratches the surface of the family's true wealth, which flows through private investments, real estate holdings, and what financial insiders call legacy positions, board seats and advisory roles that come with being a Bush. Then there's Jeb Bush, the former Florida governor who many thought would be the 3rd Bush president. His $40 million fortune comes from private equity deals, real estate ventures, and speaking fees that reportedly hit $75,000 per appearance. After his failed 2016 presidential bid, where Donald Trump mockingly called him low energy, Jeb quietly returned to the business world, adding millions more to his portfolio. The family's most prized possession sits on a rocky promontory jutting into the Atlantic Ocean in Kennebunkport, Maine. Walker's Point Estate, purchased by Bush's great-grandfather and his son in 1902 for an undisclosed sum, now contains a 9-bedroom main house, guest quarters, a pool, tennis court, and boat dock, all protected by Secret Service when a Bush is in residence. The property survived a 1991 storm with 30-foot waves that demolished the guest house and swept family heirlooms out to sea. Today, locals reverently call it the Bush Compound, and tourists can glimpse it from a tiny parking area across the water, though most don't know the estate harbours a century-old connection to the very financial institutions that would later be seized by the US government. For in 1942, federal agents walked into the offices of Union Banking Corporation on Wall Street and took control of its assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act. Before the Bush name became synonymous with American presidencies and Texas oil, it belonged to a line of shrewd Connecticut bankers who understood that real power lived not in politics, but in the quiet corridors of Wall Street. The dynasty's true architect was Prescott Sheldon Bush, born May 15, 1895, in Columbus, Ohio, a man whose Yale pedigree and Skull and Bones membership would set the template for generations of Bush men to follow. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with an aristocratic bearing that commanded boardrooms, Prescott married Dorothy Walker in 1921, joining his destiny to one of Missouri's wealthiest banking families. His new father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, wasn't just any banker. He was president of W.A. Harriman & Company and would later give his name to a future president. By 1931, Prescott had become a managing partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, the most powerful private banking house in America. From their offices at 59 Wall Street, Prescott and his partners controlled a web of investments that stretched from American railroads to German steel. It was through this network that Prescott became one of 7 directors of a modest-looking bank called Union Banking Corporation. On paper, UBC appeared to be just another investment vehicle serving European clients. In reality, it was the American banking arm for Fritz Thyssen, the German steel magnate who had bankrolled Adolf Hitler since 1923. Thyssen himself would later write a book with the chilling title I Paid Hitler, detailing how he funded the Nazi Party's rise to power. Through UBC, millions of dollars flowed between Germany and America, even as Hitler's regime began its march toward war. Prescott's other business interests were equally entangled with Nazi Germany. The Silesian American Corporation controlled valuable coal and zinc mines in Poland that would later use slave labor from concentration camps. July 1942 brought a devastating headline in the New York Herald Tribune that made Prescott Bush's blood run cold. Hitler's angel has $3 million in US bank. The article revealed that Union Banking Corporation was holding Nazi money, possibly to be held for Nazi bigwigs. Prescott and his partners scrambled to explain their position as merely an unpaid courtesy for a client. But their explanations fell on deaf ears at the Treasury Department, where officials were building a case under the Trading with the Enemy Act. On October 20th, 1942, while American soldiers were preparing to fight Nazis in North Africa, federal agents walked into Union Banking Corporation and seized all assets. They found what government investigators called a U.S. holding company with German and Polish subsidiaries that was actively managing Nazi interests. The seizure order specifically named Prescott Bush as one of the directors whose shares were confiscated as being held for enemy nationals. In the dusty government files, one document stood out, a report confirming that Prescott's bank was closely affiliated with United Steel Works, which produced half the steel for the Nazi war machine. Yet somehow, this scandal that should have destroyed the Bush family would instead become the foundation of their incredible rise to power. The government seizure that should have destroyed Prescott Bush instead became the foundation of a political dynasty that would reshape American history. After the war ended, federal authorities quietly returned the confiscated assets to their American shareholders, including Prescott Bush, along with a settlement of $1,500,000. This Nazi-tainted money, never publicly acknowledged by the family, would fund the Bush dynasty's rise from Wall Street to the White House. Prescott emerged from the scandal not as a pariah, but as a respected Connecticut businessman, his Skull and Bones connections and Brown Brothers Harriman partnership intact. By 1947, he'd reinvented himself as Connecticut's Republican finance chairman, raising money for the party while carefully cultivating his image as a moderate progressive. His first Senate run in 1950 ended in heartbreak, losing to Democrat William Benton by just 1,102 votes out of 850,000 cast. But Prescott had learned a crucial lesson. In Connecticut politics, being too closely tied to controversial causes could sink a campaign. When Senator Brian McMahon died suddenly in 1952, Prescott seized his chance, defeating future Connecticut Governor Abraham Ribicoff to claim the seat. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with silver hair and patrician bearing, one Senate staffer remarked that Prescott looked more like a senator than any senator I've ever met. In Washington, Prescott became President Dwight Eisenhower's loyal ally and occasional golfing partner, supporting the interstate highway system and voting for the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960. He served on the powerful Banking and Currency Committee, the same institution that had once investigated his Nazi banking connections, with no one daring to mention his past. Meanwhile, Prescott was grooming his sons for greatness, particularly his second boy, George Herbert Walker Bush, born in Milton, Massachusetts, on June 12, 1924. Young George had absorbed the family lessons: Yale, Skull and Bones, military service, then make your fortune before entering politics. In 1948, rejecting his father's Wall Street path, George H.W. Bush packed his red Studebaker and drove to Odessa, Texas, to enter the oil business. Using family connections and Eastern money, including funds traced back to the Union banking settlement, George built Zapata Petroleum into $1 million enterprise. By 1962, when Prescott retired from the Senate, he had successfully transformed the Bush name from Nazi-connected bankers to respected public servants. His parting gift to his son was a Rolodex of connections stretching from Texas oil fields to CIA headquarters, from corporate boardrooms to the highest levels of the Republican Party. The family even had a new origin story: not Wall Street financiers with uncomfortable German connections, but Texas oilmen and New England patriots. Prescott Bush died on October 8, 1972, living just long enough to see his son George become ambassador to the United Nations. But even Prescott couldn't have imagined how far his Nazi-funded fortune would carry the family name into the highest echelons of American power. The phone call came at 1:45 in the afternoon on November 22, 1963, just 75 minutes after President Kennedy's motorcade was torn apart by gunfire in Dallas. George H.W. Bush, then a 39-year-old oil executive and Republican Party chairman, placed an urgent call to the FBI from Tyler, Texas, reporting a suspicious character who might be involved in the assassination. The call seemed oddly specific for a random tip. Bush named James Parrott, a harmless local Republican volunteer, as a potential threat to the president who was already dead. Years later, researchers would wonder why Bush felt compelled to establish his whereabouts with federal authorities on the day that changed America forever. Even more puzzling was Bush's claim that he couldn't remember where he was when Kennedy died, making him perhaps the only American of his generation with such convenient amnesia. Then, in 1985, journalist Joseph McBride uncovered a bombshell while researching in the National Archives, an FBI memo from J. Edgar Hoover himself, dated November 29, 1963. The memo stated that Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency had been briefed about the reaction of anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Miami to Kennedy's assassination. When confronted with this document, Bush claimed it must refer to another George Bush, and the CIA produced a low-level researcher named George William Bush who denied any knowledge of such a briefing. But the evidence of Bush's intelligence connections stretched back even further. His business partner at Zapata Oil, Thomas Devine, was a CIA staff employee, a relationship documented as early as 1953. By January 1976, when President Gerald Ford nominated Bush to become Director of Central Intelligence, the CIA was drowning in scandal. The Church Committee had exposed assassination plots, illegal domestic spying, and covert operations that shocked even hardened Washington insiders. Senator Frank Church immediately opposed Bush's nomination, calling him a partisan political operative who would politicize the agency at its most vulnerable moment. Bush was, in fact, the first openly political figure ever nominated to run the CIA. Previous directors had been military men, Wall Street lawyers, or career intelligence officers. The confirmation hearings in December 1975 should have been brutal, with Democrats controlling 60 Senate seats and many still furious about Bush's role defending Nixon during Watergate. Then, on December 23rd, just as Bush's nomination hung by a thread, CIA Station Chief Richard Welch was assassinated in Athens, Greece. The White House and CIA immediately blamed congressional investigations for Welch's death, though there was zero evidence linking the Church Committee's work to his murder. Ford waived regulations to bury Welch at Arlington Cemetery, and his body was flown home to arrive during the Today Show, maximizing public impact. Suddenly, opposing Bush meant opposing the CIA itself, and enough Democrats buckled to confirm him on January 30th, 1976. In just 1 year as director, Bush would forge relationships and gather secrets that would serve him for the next 4 decades of his political rise. On Christmas Eve, 1992, just weeks before leaving the White House in defeat, George H.W. Bush committed the final act of a conspiracy that began in 1986. With the stroke of his presidential pen, Bush pardoned 6 men convicted in the Iran-Contra scandal, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, whose trial was set to begin in 12 days. Weinberger's private notebooks contained damning evidence of Bush's deep involvement in illegally selling weapons to Iran and funneling the profits to Nicaraguan death squads. Independent counsel Lawrence Walsh exploded with rage, declaring that the Iran-Contra cover-up, which has continued for more than 6 years, has now been completed. Bush justified the pardons by claiming the men were motivated by patriotism, but the real motive was self-preservation. As president, Bush himself would have been called to testify under oath about his role. This was the same George H.W. Bush who had claimed to be out of the loop on Iran-Contra, even as his own diary revealed he knew everything from the beginning. His attorney general who advised him on these pardons was William Barr, the same man who would later serve Donald Trump in the same role. Despite losing to Bill Clinton in 1992, the Bush dynasty was far from finished. 8 years later, Prescott's grandson, George Walker Bush, stood on the precipice of the presidency, locked in the tightest election in American history against Vice President Al Gore. On election night, November 7, 2000, the networks called Florida for Gore, then for Bush, then declared it too close to call. When the dust settled, Bush led by just 537 votes out of nearly 6 million cast in Florida, a margin that triggered automatic recounts and lawsuits. For 36 days, America watched as hanging chads and dimpled ballots became household words, while armies of lawyers descended on the Sunshine State. The battle reached the Supreme Court, where 5 conservative justices, including 2 appointed by Bush's father, voted to stop the Florida recount on December 12th. In Bush versus Gore, the court's 5-4 decision effectively handed the presidency to George W. Bush, making him the first president since 1888 to lose the popular vote but win the office. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who provided the crucial framework for stopping the recount, would later express regret about the decision that many saw as nakedly partisan. With George W. Bush's inauguration on January 20, 2001, the transformation was complete. From Prescott Bush's Nazi banking connections to 2 Bush presidencies spanning 12 years. The money that began in union banking corporations' seized accounts had funded a political dynasty that reached the absolute pinnacle of American power. Today, even after Jeb Bush's failed 2016 presidential campaign, the family's influence continues through corporate boards, think tanks, and the next generation positioning for power. The Bush dynasty proved that in America, with enough money, connections, and strategic amnesia, even the darkest origins can be laundered into the highest respectability. And now, we'd like to see you in the comments. Were you familiar with this aspect of the Bush family's history? And what is your opinion on this information? We can't wait to hear from you. And with that said, thanks for joining us for another episode of Old Money Luxury. Cheers. Until the next one.